Hello everyone! In this video, I will discuss the Trade Federation's main battle tank and one of the Confederacy of Independent Systems' primary heavy combat vehicles. If you appreciate my work, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. It will greatly assist the channel's development. You can also help by donating on Patreon. Thank you in advance, and let's get started. The first AAT tanks appeared in the arsenal of the Trade Federation's droid army a couple of decades before the events of Episode 1. They appeared when the Trade Federation leadership realized that it was time to take action, as the Senate began to pass laws that hit the Neimoidians' pockets. Tanks and combat droids were one of the means of protecting the Trade Federation's existing assets and conquering new markets, production centers, convenient trade routes, and the like. The Trade Federation had existed for more than 300 years and was not accustomed to losing. Shortly before the Naboo Crisis, another obstacle to the expansion of the Trade Federation was the adoption by the Galactic Senate of Resolution BR-0371 on the taxation of hyperspace routes in the outer and middle rings. The new taxes were intended to patch a huge hole in the Republican budget, and that's when the Neimoidians' patience ran out. Darth Sidious also persuaded the Neimoidians to attack his home planet in order to put pressure on the senator. The senator became the victim, so to speak, and won the election. And the Trade Federation had plenty of resources to wage war. Even before the BR-0371 resolution was passed, the Trade Federation's armed forces, the Trade Defense Force, had been actively stocking up on combat droids and new military equipment. This included AAT tanks. The AAT tank was developed by Bactoid Armor Workshop, one of the companies that actually belonged to the Trade Federation. Bactoid had long been involved in the development and production of weapons, military and civilian equipment, combat and astromechanical droids, fighters, and bombers. However, prior to the order from its parent company, Bactoid did not manufacture heavy tanks. The AAT was their most heavily armored product at the time of Episode 1. It is noteworthy that Bactoid, despite its vast experience in droid manufacturing, did not immediately create a tank droid, such as the NRN-99 tank droid created by Techno Union. When creating the AAT, Bactoid engineers made the controls most convenient for B1 series droid manipulators, but nothing prevented ordinary organics from sitting behind the controls. The most versatile repulsor chassis was chosen for the AAT. Repulsors kept the tank in the air and propelled it forward. In order to reduce the size of the machine, lower its cost, and increase its protection, the tank was not equipped with jet or ion engines. As a result of using only repulsors, the AAT's maximum speed was only 55 kilometers per hour, but the tank's developers decided that high speed was unnecessary for an assault tank. The tank was supposed to serve as a battering ram, clearing the way for its infantry with cannons and shells and supporting them with fire. Considering the speed of the infantry droids, 20 kilometers per hour was quite sufficient for the tank. The front of the AAT has very thick armor, which allows the tank to destroy field fortifications and punch holes in walls. The use of a repulsor chassis allowed the tank to be less dependent on the terrain and to overcome obstacles in its path more easily. For example, fallen trees, ditches, trenches, or ruins of houses. The tank, hovering a couple of meters above the surface, was not afraid of contact mines. However, the capabilities of repulsors should not be overestimated. If you drive a tank without skill, even repulsors can get stuck, as was the case in the events on Rugosa in first episode of the first season of the animated series Clone Wars. Repulsors also have their drawbacks. In particular, repulsor technology cannot pass through planetary shields. This is why the AAT tanks were unable to engage the Gungans at the very beginning of the battle. They had to wait for the B1 droids to destroy the shield projector. Only then did the Gungans valiantly flee toward the forest, waving their ears. Repulsor technology also does not perform well on planets with strong ionic activity. The first ionic storm and the tanks are already unable to move. However, ionic storms were rare in the galaxy. The AAT is kept in the air and propelled by two repulsor projectors, whose grills are located at the rear and front of the vehicle. They are powered by a 4-chamber reactor and 2 onboard generators, also located at the rear of the tank under the cover of armor. The energy from the reactor can be used to fire laser cannons, but the cannons have their own power source, represented by a set of energy cells located in another part of the tank away from the reactor. This proved to be a very successful solution, allowing the tank's weapons to be used when the reactor is disabled or turned off so as not to attract attention with the heat it emits. It also saves reactor fuel and the reactor's resources. The energy cells can be replaced without leaving the tank. Fortunately, there is plenty of space inside to store a couple of boxes of energy cells. The tank's armament is numerous and varied. The main weapon of the AAT is a heavy laser cannon in a rotating turret. It is a powerful, long-range, and fairly accurate weapon with good armor penetration capabilities. However, the laser's armor-piercing effect is naturally less than that of a blaster weapon or mass driver projectile. At the time of its introduction, this cannon could penetrate almost any armored vehicle that the Trade Federation might encounter. However, during the Clone Wars, the cannon's power was sometimes insufficient to penetrate the armor of ATTE walkers and some other Republic armored vehicles. Although the AAT cannon could penetrate the armor of light tanks of the Grand Army of the Republic, such as the TX-130, without any problems. The main weapon was controlled by the tank commander sitting in the turret. 2 auxiliary laser or blaster cannons were mounted on the sides of the tank. Both variants were equally common. These cannons were used to destroy infantry, unarmored and lightly armored vehicles. Each cannon is equipped with its own rangefinder. The cannons have excellent vertical and horizontal aiming angles, which is why they were often used as anti-aircraft machine guns to engage low-flying targets. Although during the battle in Episode 1, one of the tanks shot down an N-1 fighter with its main gun, which was not intended for this purpose. These auxiliary guns are controlled by gunners sitting on either side of the driver. However, like any blaster, these guns have a short range, and they are located quite low, which sometimes makes them difficult to use in rough terrain. Even lower, the creators of the AAT placed a launcher that took up most of the space in the lower part of the tank. During the events of Episode 1, the AATs had 3 types of shells. Anti-bunker shells were used to destroy pillboxes, break through bunker walls, and destroy buildings with infantry entrenched inside. After penetrating a wall or armor, such a shell would then explode, hitting the enemy with a blast wave and shrapnel, including fragments of the wall that had just been penetrated. The second type of shell was armor-piercing. The third type was high-energy shells designed to engage infantry in open terrain and behind light field fortifications, as well as to destroy unarmored speeders. Upon launch, the shells were enveloped in a cocoon of high-energy plasma, which increased the armor penetration and velocity of the ammunition. Later, the AAT's ammunition load was supplemented with high-explosive fragmentation shells and anti-tank guided missiles. However, this capability was rarely used. The tank's ammunition load was 55 to 57 shells. In other words, the ammunition load was very impressive, but not everything was so good. First, the launchers were located at the base of the vehicle, which meant that they could not always be used. Secondly, it was impossible to reload the tank in the field. To do this, it was necessary to return to the landing craft or carrier ship, where there was special equipment for installing new magazines with shells. Sometimes the tank was reloaded by replacing the entire lower part. Fortunately, this was done quickly. And thirdly, the very fact of using shells with explosives increased the explosion hazard of the vehicle. If the enemy managed to pierce the lower plate and detonate the ammunition, the tank would burn out very quickly or, in the worst case, explode, taking with it to the grave everyone who was unlucky enough to be nearby. The tank was operated by 4 people: the commander, the driver, and 2 gunners. The tank commander was the most unfortunate. He was responsible for communications and sensors, controlling the tank's main gun, and giving target coordinates to the 2 gunners. And he also had to give orders to the driver on where to direct the tank. If the tank commander was also the commander of the unit, then firing the main gun was out of the question. If the crew consisted of specially modified droids connected to each other by a single information network, then things weren't so bad. But if the tank had to be operated by ordinary people, then it was not so easy. The tank was controlled by a driver mechanic sitting in the front of the vehicle. He could see the battlefield using external cameras and a periscope. If the cameras and periscope were out of order, he could drive the tank by looking through the open front hatch or following the commander's orders. The tank commander also had a periscope and external view cameras. But despite all this, many AAT commanders liked to be in plain sight, sticking out of the hatch up to their waists, which greatly pleased enemy snipers. To the delight of the AAT commander, the double hatch provided good coverage for his body from the sides. Unless, of course, the commander was too large, like General Worm Loathsome, who commanded the ground forces of the Confederacy of Independent Systems in the Battle of Christophsis. In addition to their own eyes, enemy vehicles and infantry could be detected using sensors, the receiving antennas of which were located on the turret. Data from the sensors was displayed on the screens of the tank commander and 2 gunners. The crew entered the tank through a hatch with a ramp at the rear or through a hatch at the front of the vehicle. In the Trade Federation Army, AAT tanks were originally operated by specially modified B-1 droids. They were distinguished by their blue markings. After the events of Episode 1, the Trade Federation launched a major program to modernize old droids, which meant that all B-1 series droids could operate armored vehicles. However, even during the Clone Wars, there was a special modification of the B-1 for operating tanks. Their programming was slightly different from that of infantry droids. Now it's time to talk about security and survivability. When designing the assault tank, the engineers apparently took the task too literally, concentrating almost all of the armor and armament in the front of the vehicle. The rear hatch and some components at the rear of the tank had very thin armor. Too thin. In the Trade Federation's military doctrine, the main task of the AAT was to protect MTT transporters until they were unloaded, and then to provide fire support for the advancing B-1s or to move ahead, clearing the way for the infantry. This doctrine was tested in practice. Before invading Naboo, the Trade Federation tested its infantry and tanks in numerous battles with competitors on some remote worlds of the Outer Rim. In addition to its vulnerable stern, the AAT suffered from a lack of protection against electromagnetic weapons. This was a big problem for the tank and especially the robotic crew inside. In the event of an electromagnetic mine explosion or ion cannon fire, not only the tank itself but also its entire crew would be disabled. If the battlefield remained under Separatist control, there would be no problem. But what if the battlefield was controlled by the enemy? They would replace the wiring and electronics that did not survive the electromagnetic pulse and get a whole tank. The front and side armor of the tank was strong enough to withstand hits from many types of laser and blaster cannons, as well as some models of anti-tank guided missiles and rocket-propelled grenades from anti-tank grenade launchers. The rear armor, especially in the area of the hatch with the ramp, could only withstand hits from small arms and light blaster cannons. And even then, not all of them. The resourceful clones of the Grand Army of the Republic eagerly took advantage of this feature of the armor. By failing to properly protect the rear of the tank, the engineers at Bactoid apparently did not consider that in urban combat conditions, there would inevitably be those who would find a way to get behind the tank and exploit this flaw. In general, the tank's frontal armor was good, but the rear armor was not worth mentioning. However, it would be a mistake to overestimate the tank's frontal armor. Powerful anti-tank grenade launchers could penetrate it. Some blaster cannons could also penetrate it. Among grenade launchers, the PLX-1 grenade launchers could more or less cope with the front and side armor of the AAT, and things like the AV-7 howitzers could completely tear the AAT to pieces. Let's recall Episode 1 once again. The battle for the Royal Palace began when a speeder with a blaster cannon destroyed one of the AAT tanks. It was a V-19 Geon land speeder. Its cannon, when charged, could pierce the front armor of the AAT, especially in the area of the front hatch. It is also worth mentioning some of the peculiarities of combat operations on Naboo involving tanks. The film only showed us the beginning of the invasion and the escape of the Jedi and the Queen with her servants and guards from the planet. Everything else remained behind the scenes. While Amidala watched the races on Tatooine with interest, met the future Vader there, and enjoyed herself on Coruscant, a struggle for survival against the occupiers was taking place on her home planet. In open combat, militias, police, and guards were no match for the droids and their tanks. Therefore, almost immediately after the start of the invasion, the defenders took refuge in the forests and swamps where the enemy's superiority in numbers and firepower was not so significant. Only a few desperate and foolish individuals attempted to attack the occupiers in the open. I am referring to the Royal Horse Guard, riding on Guarlaras. The Horse Guard was made up of descendants of the most respected noble houses on the planet, with the arrogance inherent in aristocrats, and pedigrees like a poodle at a dog show. It was fitting for these illustrious gentlemen to hide and avoid battle. This was unworthy of a knight. And so, seeing the Trade Federation squadron approaching the city of Heart Secure, led by AAT tanks, the guardsmen with their banners unfurled and their power lances at the ready, galloped forward in unison and with courage. But the droids did not understand their noble impulse and quickly finished off the guards. Cavalry was sometimes used very successfully in the galaxy, but not in a head-on collision and not against tanks. The less noble inhabitants of Naboo fled to the forests and swamps, from where they made raids against the occupiers on armed land speeders and air speeders. Faced with highly successful guerrilla tactics, the Neimoidians were quite surprised. AAT tanks were designed for assault operations and for breaking through enemy fortified defenses, not for hunting down guerrillas. In these battles, the AATs served as well-armored and armed mobile firing points to reinforce the firepower of strongholds and checkpoints. For this reason, some of the AAT tanks were withdrawn from the planet shortly after the occupation. Incidentally, during the occupation of Naboo, 33 heavy landing craft C-9979 carried out the landing, delivering 11,286 tanks to the planet. It is unknown how many tanks remained on the planet's surface during the final battle for Naboo, and how many of them ended up in the hands of the local government as military trophies. Before the start of the Clone Wars, the Bactoid Company created several modifications of the AAT. Some tanks had increased speed and maneuverability, others had increased armor thickness, and there was also a modification with deflector shields. In addition, Bactoid experimented with the composition of weapons. However, these were all small-scale variants that never caught the interest of the Trade Federation. Therefore, the same tank model that had fought on Naboo 10 years earlier was mainly used in the Clone Wars. AAT tanks were not modernized during the Clone Wars. While Bactoid was thinking about how to improve the AAT, the Separatist crisis was heating up. More and more planets and planetary systems were leaving the Republic, and mega corporations were gradually building up their forces, including the production of new tanks. It couldn't go on like this forever. At one point, the masses and their leaders got tired of idling and decided it was time to fight. More precisely, they expected to defeat the weak resistance of the Republic, but they had to deal with clones. And these clones knew how to fight back. Before the Clone Wars and during the war, several interesting combat vehicles were created at the AAT base. First and foremost among these was the HAG, Heavy Artillery Gun. The auxiliary guns were removed, and instead of a heavy gun, a weapon of very impressive caliber and serious power was installed. These HAGs were used to provide fire support for infantry and armored vehicles and to destroy enemy fortifications. In rare cases, they were used as anti-tank guns. It was a very powerful weapon, but it was slow-moving and defenseless against aircraft. Engineers from Bactoid also created a similar self-propelled gun based on the MTT transporter. Since the MTT had a lot of space, they were able to install a very powerful gun in it. Another interesting self-propelled vehicle based on the AAT was the DDT. The abbreviation DDT stands for Defoliator Deployment Tank. This variation was created by Neimoidian General and Engineer Locke Durd. The DDT cannon was designed to fire shells with a special incendiary filling that burned organic matter, but did not harm droids. The first test of the DDT took place on the planet Maridun under the personal supervision of Locke Durd himself. The Neimoidian did not expect serious resistance from the local natives and therefore landed on the planet himself. But Maridun was home not only to harmless Lurmen, but also to several Jedi and clones. As a result, the experimental DDT was destroyed, and General Locke was taken prisoner. Nevertheless, this did not stop work on the self-propelled vehicle. In the second half of the war, it was used several times on the battlefield. For example, Grievous used DDT in the battle with the Night Sisters on Dathomir at the end of the war. Immediately after the end of the Clone Wars, and 19 years before the Battle of Yavin, the young Galactic Empire began to actively increase the size of its armed forces. And here the Empire faced an acute shortage of armored vehicles. For this reason, it was decided to temporarily include captured equipment and droids in the Imperial forces. Thus, Droidecus, DSD-1 Spider droids, and other equipment appeared in the Imperial forces. The AAT tanks were not forgotten either. These machines had proven themselves well during the war, were well mastered by many factories in production, and moreover, were operated competently. Clones and ordinary soldiers sat in tanks that had been firing at them just a few months earlier. This continued for several years until the Empire produced a sufficient number of new armored vehicles. However, in some units, AAT tanks served for a long time. They fought until the Battle of Yavin. The last known case of combat use of Imperial AATs was recorded as late as 2 years after the Battle of Yavin. We know that at least several dozen AAT tanks fell into the hands of the Rebel Alliance. Most likely, there were many more. Unlike the ATTE, the rebels did not modernize them. Some AATs inevitably fell into the hands of criminals and other illegal armed groups. A number of tanks ended up in private collections. For example, we know the fate of one AAT tank that fell into private hands. During the Imperial period, a Wookiee named Quagga lived on Tatooine. He was an Imperial slave, but managed to escape. Quagga opened a car repair shop on the outskirts of Anchorhead, but quickly found himself on the verge of bankruptcy. Quagga used his last money to repair an AAT tank and took part in a competition organized by Jabba. He hoped to use the money he won to open a large, well-equipped workshop in the heart of Mos Eisley. If he lost, he would face the fate of a slave. But since the Wookiee's workshop never appeared, we can assume that Quagga and his tank met a sad fate. Such is the interesting history and design of the AAT tank, the main tank of the Trade Federation and one of the main heavy combat vehicles of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. This will greatly help the channel grow. You can also help by donating on Patreon. Thank you all and see you next time.